So first of all, thank you very much for braving the weather this evening. It seems like it's pretty atmospheric, given that witches is one of my topics for tonight, but it wasn't intentional. I didn't order the rain, so I am sorry for that. So when I was having to think about what I wanted to talk about for today's lecture, this idea of words mattering is one that's actually really important to my research. So I've done quite a bit of work on looking at magical women in the 15th century and thinking about how some of those traditions extend through to the present day. And what's really important about some of those ideas in literature of the 15th century are ideas about the origins of some of these figures, so where they come from, what that means in terms of their status and their representation within these texts. And these words, these labels that are given to these figures indicate immediately to the reader a whole set of connotations about what that character, where that character comes from, what that character can do within the text. So that's kind of where the connection to the idea of words mattering is starting for me with this talk this evening. So we're going to be looking at a few magical women in particular today. I don't have time, and I'm sure you don't have time, for me to look at all of them. So we're going to pull out a few examples and start thinking about how some of these definitions and labels shift and change and develop across the 15th century, and what that then means for the post-medieval. And I wanted to start today by having a look at this image, which is not medieval, although it does depict a medieval character. So you might have seen this on some of the advertising for tonight's event. So this is a portrait from 1864 of Morgan Le Fay, who's one of the most famous magical women of Arthurian romances. And this painting appears as part of the Victorian revival. So there's a period during the Victorian era where there's a really renewed interest in medieval literature. There's a lot of retellings, so Tennyson, for instance, and there's a real desire to kind of rethink some of these characters and consider what they mean. And I think this is a good way in of us thinking about some of these figures and this transitional moment where we have this kind of swirl in the medieval period that I'll talk about in a little bit, and then what happens post medieval romance in terms of these characters' ongoing transformations. So I wanted to just draw your attention to a couple of things when we're looking at this character. So this is Morgan Le Fay. She's in the middle of casting a spell in this particular portrait. And some of the details that we can see in the background here, we've got a loom. And this is particularly important because part of the narrative about Morgan Le Fay is that she weaves a cloak for her brother, King Arthur. And it's a magical cloak, which sounds super fun until you realise that it's designed to burn him to death when he puts it on. And this is pretty much the epitome of Morgan Le Fay. So often her magic, certainly post-medieval, is often quite evil and sinister. So Sandys has chosen to include this detail in the background here, and the spell that she's in the middle of casting is to do with this magical cloak. We can also see that she's adorned with animal skins and bright colours. Again, we've got particular stylistic choice here, which I'll come back to talking about in a second. But this idea that she's kind of the dominant hunter, I think, is supposed to be indicated by this use of animal skins. We've also got a selection of magical implements and symbols scattered around in this image. So hopefully you can just about make that out. In the cupboard on the left-hand side of the portrait, we've got a selection of scrolls and what looks like magical potions. Similarly, scattered along the floor here, we seem to have what looks like a medieval manuscript. Again, more scrolls, what looks like more ingredients. And even on her outfit, we've got these slightly mysterious looking symbols. Again, kind of infusing this image with the sense of magic and witchcraft and power. And if we look then at Morgan herself, There's been quite a lot of critical consideration of this portrait, and a consideration of particularly the way that she's wearing her hair, so it's kind of loose and free flowing. The angle of her face, so she's not looking directly at us, she's focused on the magic spell she's performing. This angle of her hands, demonstrating how she's controlling the spell. And I've also got, there you go. Again, not sure how well you can see this, but she's really angry in this portrait. Now, what's really interesting for us is that we start to see in this Victorian revival some reconsiderations of Morgan Le Fay, but also some tropes that we're already very familiar with from the medieval romances. So some of these aspects of narrative, this poisoning of Arthur, this kind of anger and hatred that come through in this figure are really important to us. What's interesting for us in terms of what we'll come back to a bit later is this careful positioning of the kind of magic that Morgan Le Fay does. So this use of a kind of literary, text-based magic, all of the books and scrolls, it's quite a different kind of magic than the kind that we often see with women in the romances. So we'll come back in a little bit to thinking about some differences between witch, fairy, goddess, and what this signifies in terms of some of those different kinds of magic. But we have this tradition established with Morgan and her connection to text. Now, what we can also have a look at in terms of this particular artist is that he uses the same model for 3 of his portraits, and these are the other 2. So the first one's Morgan Le Fay, the second is Vivian, who is also a character from Arthurian literature. She's also a magical figure from Arthurian literature. So interesting that we have that connection immediately with the similarities with the same model being used. And then the third portrait is Medea, who is a classical figure, but is also a magical practitioner. So we have this really conscious decision by this artist to replicate some of these aspects across these 3 figures. We can start to see some of the similarities between them, and that extends beyond the model to maybe some of the ways in which they're posed, some of the things that we can see surrounding them, some of the props, and some of the ways we might consider this figure. And I wanted to kind of start there because I think that's a really nice visual representation of some of these connections between the magical figures that we begin to see developing in the romances, developing in the medieval period, but continuing that authors and artists are able to start to draw some connections and think about what these magical women have in common, and also maybe the ways in which they're different. So taking us back then to the medieval period, going back a few hundred years. I'm sorry, this lecture will jump around a little bit between quite disparate historic periods. What I'm particularly going to look at today is a text by Sir Thomas Malory called the Morte d'Arthur. You might have heard of it. It's pretty famous, but you might also not have heard of it in terms of its medieval version. You might be more familiar with these stories as they have been reimagined and reworked and rewritten in the 500 years or so since then. So Thomas Malory writes this text in about 1470, and it's a particularly important text for us as contemporary readers because it's so influential after the medieval period. So he writes it in 1470. By 1485, William Caxton produces a printed edition of it, and it's one of the earliest English printed texts. And it becomes really popular at this particular period in history. It gets reprinted a couple of times in fairly quick succession for late medieval, early modern period. And the reason that it's so popular is that it draws together hundreds of years of the development of Arthurian stories into one enormous anthology that includes not all of the different stories, but most of the different stories from across the medieval period. Malory collects those all together. He translates them into English. So Arthurian romances appear in Latin, in French, in English, and in a range of other European languages. Malory produces a kind of compendium of all of those stories, translated into English, But he's not just a translator, he's also an editor, he's also reworking lots of this material. He makes a series of decisions, he reshapes characters, he writes new bits, he completely reworks all of these different stories, different ideas into a single text. So Peter Field has talked about this idea of Malory's Morte d'Arthur being the most influential of all the Arthurian texts. He talks about it bringing together a great deal of what the Middle Ages accepted, and also then that becoming almost the standard version of these stories beyond the medieval period. Now, if you're interested in finding out a bit more about this as a book, in terms of its transition and journey, and in terms of the way in which the printed edition and the manuscript version of it may be a bit different, there's a fantastic website called maloryproject.com. Now, my only proviso with that is they had a really dodgy project assistant on that project. So anything written by Zoë Enstone, watch out for that, avoid that. Everything else on the website is great. Yeah, if you're interested in finding out a bit more about the book history, do have a look at that. But that's kind of our focus for today. I want us to think about Malory's Morte d'Arthur as this transitional point. So we have all of the preceding medieval texts, comes together in this one Arthurian romance that then goes on to influence, whoops, too excited, goes on to influence all of the development of Arthurian romance and Arthurian stories in England after the medieval period. So I mentioned already, Malory's drawing on a really wide range of texts. These are just some of his sources, which you don't really need to know about, but I just wanted you to have a sense of how extensive this one kind of compendium piece really is. And if we're thinking about some of the chronology here, some of the earliest of medieval romances are in the kind of early 12th century, and then right the way through to Thomas Malory in 1470. There are hundreds of different medieval romances during this period, and a romance is not our modern day idea of a love story. Romances in the medieval period are stories about knights and chivalry and adventures, and often magic, which is obviously why they're relevant for today. And what we also have is that, again, there's hundreds of different texts. I've included some of the biggest ones on this slide. What we also find is that because it's in the medieval period, we also have multiple versions of each of these. So there's not always a consistency between different versions of the text. You've got to remember this is in a time when everything's being copied out by hand and transmitted piece by piece. People rewrite things. It's a bit like fanfic today as well. So lots of people are using the same characters, the same scenarios, the same ideas, reworking them, rethinking them, reshaping them according to their own interests. There's quite a lot going on. We can also have a think about what happens in terms of the influences for some of these medieval texts. So if we're thinking particularly about magical women, which I will talk about a bit more in a second, we also have a range of potential sources. So not only do we have this really complicated transition history where we have lots of different medieval texts, lots of different authors, lots of different approaches and ideas, we also have lots of different potential sources for some of these materials. We have classical sources. So, for instance, Medea and Circe as these kind of famous sorceresses or goddesses of the classical period are really influential then on the way that magical women of the medieval period develop and change. We have lots of work has been done looking at potential Irish and Welsh myth as the source for a lot of these figures. There's probably about 100 years worth of criticism that's tried to trace some of these characteristics back to these early myths. And we also have allegorical representation. So we can start to have a look at some of these figures in terms of the way that they are linked to characters like lust or prophecy or these kind of abstract personifications. We can also start to see some of the connections from there. So essentially, we have this range of potential sources. we have loads of different authors who interpret and change and shift and develop those in lots of different ways across lots of different characters. So we have this array of different ways in which people interpret and create characters based on this range of different sources and the way in which these ideas continually develop across the medieval period. So if we think more specifically then about a couple of examples, I'm going to talk a bit today about a character called Morgan Le Fay, who of course appeared in the portrait that I started with. So she's King Arthur's sister. She is a magic woman that appears across a really wide range of romances, and she's very diverse in the way that different authors represent her. In very broad terms, she's particularly famous for her healing abilities. So some of the earliest versions of the stories about Morgan Le Fay focus on the Isle of Avalon, which is where King Arthur is supposed to be taken at the point where he's dying. And we have this ambiguity over King Arthur's death. So does he go to Avalon to be healed? Does he go to Avalon to die? We have this time spent with Morgan Le Fay, and that tradition, that kind of ambiguity over Avalon, leads to these ideas about Arthur's return, this idea of him as the once and future king you might have heard of from much more recent authors. Now, conversely, we also have a range of traditions where Morgan has the ability to heal someone, but instead she doesn't. She, in fact, causes them more pain because sometimes she's evil in the romances. So we have this kind of double-sidedness to her most famous set of attributes. She has the power of transformation. There's a particularly famous moment where she's evading capture. So she's caused all kind of bother at court. She's being chased by Arthur and a range of his knights, and she transforms herself and all of her followers into stone so that she evades capture. And there's this really interesting moment in the romances where the knights come and find this statue of her and all of her followers, and they say, "This is the work of God. God has taken his vengeance. He has turned them all into stone because of how evil they are." And then so off he goes, and then of course she transforms them all back and they escape. So we have this kind of power of enchantment and transformation. In some of the earlier texts, she has the power of flight, which I find particularly fascinating. There's one of the earliest versions of Morgan Le Fay is from the Vita Merlini, and she's in Avalon. Arthur's been brought to her, and she's thinking about how she's going to heal him. And one of the things she does is to fly around Europe to all of the different educational centres in Europe to find all the best information about how to heal Arthur. There's not really a full explanation of how she flies, but I still think it's pretty cool. She also has the power of prophecy across a lot of the medieval texts. And we have this weird moment where, because the character is interpreted in so many different ways, sometimes she's described as the most beautiful woman, sometimes she's described as this slightly ugly old hag. Sometimes texts are a bit self-aware about this, and they say she's actually hideous, but if people are under an enchantment, sometimes they think she's beautiful. So it's kind of an explanation sometimes of this duality of the way that she's represented. What we also find is that sometimes the texts go a little bit further in terms of the way that they depict her. So there's less ambiguity and more certainty about how good or evil she is. So this extract is from the post-Vulgate Quest del Saint Graal, which is the quest for the Holy Grail. This is one of the later texts. So we've had quite a bit of development leading up to this point. And this is a dream that one of the characters has. So he has this dream about hell, and he has this dream that Morgan Le Fay appears to him from hell and comes out with this range of devils kind of hanging off of her, and she's warning him, well, she acts as a warning about the dangers of hell and the dangers of sin and what happens to you if you sin during your life, then you'll end up in hell after death. So we have this really kind of interesting range of ways that Morgan Le Fay is depicted across the romances. And critics have got really excited about this. So they've had a look at what happens, they've looked at the transitions across different romances, and lots of critics have pulled out a particular chain of texts, and they've suggested that we can start to see a pattern. So Anne Berthelot says her reputation tends to degenerate from one romance to the next, and she reflects on this idea that Morgan gets more and more evil. Clark Colohan similarly talks about this transition from her being a beautiful young fairy in sweetness to Arthur's wily old rival and secret enemy. Margaret Jennings talks about this transition as being from goddess to witch, from nurse to seductress, and Maureen Freeze, in an article that I just had to put the title on because it's called From the Lady to the Tramp, which just really resonated with what she was trying to say, I think. Talks about this idea of this evil besmirching Morgan's character. Now, all of this is really fascinating stuff. It's not entirely accurate, though, because what we find is that when we broaden out our exploration of the medieval romances, there's a particular chain, which is what these critics are looking at, where they're absolutely right. We can see that she gets progressively more evil, she gets progressively more ugly, she gets progressively more aggressive as these romances progress. But what we find is if we broaden out our search, if we look at some of the romances that are not in this interconnected chain, we see that there's not actually that pattern at all. So one of the very earliest romances that Morgan Le Fay appears in, right back at the beginning of the 12th century, or the middle of the 12th century, she's described as being lustful and pursuing this good knight, and he is not having any of it, and she is not taking no for an answer. So we immediately have those kind of negative attributes right at the very beginning of stories about Morgan Le Fay. And then similarly, if we go to the other end of the medieval period, we also have texts where she's entirely positive as a character. She's just the wonderful sister of Arthur who has this healing ability, who takes him off to Avalon and looks after him with the idea that he's going to come back to the world once she's healed him. So we don't necessarily have this pattern. And I think what that lets us do is it lets us start to think about, right, so we're not seeing this degeneration of a character, so what are we seeing? We begin to see that actually each individual author is making a set of decisions about how they want to portray this character, what role they want her to have, what function they want her magic to have in their particular text. And this is something that we also see with one of the other figures that I wanted to mention this evening. She goes by a few different names in the romances, so I'm largely going to call her Nimue, but she's also Nenwe, Vivienne, or Ninienne, depending on which romance you have a look at. And she's most famous for imprisoning Merlin. So hopefully you've heard of Merlin, the magician, King Arthur's advisor and kind of right-hand man during the early part of his reign. He disappears from Arthurian narratives kind of partway through the stories usually, and that's because he meets Vivienne usually, or Ninienne or Nimue, and she imprisons him somehow. Now, again, this is a little bit changeable. So in some versions of this story, we have Merlin who pursues her, they fall in love, and the reason that she imprisons him is because he keeps disappearing off and she's not that keen on that. So she imprisons him to keep them together because she loves him too. What we have in some of the other texts is a character who hates him and can't stand him, and he just keeps chasing her and she gets really annoyed, and she locks him up so that she doesn't have to be bothered with him anymore. So we have, again, this kind of really interesting split in terms of depictions and decision making about the role and function of this character, how sympathetically they're portrayed, what narrative decisions these authors are making for these particular characters. She's also famous for raising Lancelot. So there's a whole text where Lancelot gets brought up, submerged under a lake, and then kind of emerges under her tuition as the perfect knight. She also saves Lancelot in several of the romances, and that's what we see here. So Lancelot in this image has been imprisoned by Morgan Le Fay because Morgan Le Fay is that kind of girl. And Vivienne goes and saves him. So she rescues him, she restores his sanity because Morgan has in fact driven him insane at this point. And this is a function that we see quite a lot with this character, and also with these two characters more generally. They're kind of oppositional sometimes in some of these texts. And more broadly then, she protects Arthur and she protects the court. So she uses her magic often to come and help King Arthur in the court to ensure that they don't die at various intervals. So the situation I mentioned earlier, where Morgan Le Fay creates this cloak that's going to burn Arthur to death, it's Vivian or Nimue that comes and tells him that this cloak is going to kill him, so he doesn't put it on. Rather meanly, I think, he makes the messenger wear it, who had come from Morgan Le Fay, and unfortunately she does get burnt to death. But Nimue, I guess, was focusing on Arthur rather than trying to save everybody. So we have these characters then that are quite different across different texts. They're interpreted in different ways, who have different motivations attributed to them. And we also have a bit of an ambiguity about how they're defined. And this is where this kind of idea of words mattering, I think, really comes into this equation. So across a range of texts, these figures, particularly Morgan Le Fay, are referred to as goddesses. So in the Vita Merlini, which is one of the very earliest texts, we have Morgan, who's not explicitly named as a goddess, but lives on a remote island, has all these handmaidens, is very much in that kind of goddess function. In the Speculum Ecclesiae from the early 13th century, she's explicitly referred to as a goddess. And then right the way through to Gawain and the Green Knight in the late 14th century, who I think my students will be somewhat familiar with, she's also referred to a goddess there. So we have this kind of naming of her. And this is where we go back to this idea of some of these medieval romances being quite self-aware. As we also see in the 13th century Lancelot, which is part of a wider collection of texts. There's a particular bit in that text where one character says to another, oh yes, you know, the people that refer to Morgan Le Fay as a goddess are fools. So there's this idea of kind of mocking that even within the romances, this kind of difference in interpretation. So we also find, of course, that these characters are referred to as fairies or fae. And I think I should be clear here that we're not talking about kind of Tinkerbell, twee little, you know, flower fairy type figures. This is where some of those Irish and Welsh myths come into this. We're talking about kind of otherworldly figures here. And James Wade has written a particularly interesting book that looks at this problematic category of fairies or fae in the medieval romances. They don't sit neatly in a particular category. And one of the things that he looks at is how they don't also fit in particularly well with a Christian framework that he sees as beginning to evolve across the medieval romances. As we start to gather this idea of what knighthood and chivalry really should mean, this idea of Christianity becomes more and more and more important. And he suggests that actually these fairies don't neatly fit in with a lot of that. As also we see when we think about a character like Merlin, he doesn't also necessarily sit in particularly neatly to start with some of these ideas. What we see with Merlin is that he kind of gets reworked a little bit so that he does fit in. So early texts drawing on Welsh sources, and they look at Merlin as this kind of, well, there's some texts that look at him as kind of a wild man of the woods, this prophet figure. By the time we get towards the middle of the Middle Ages, we start to see that he's got this new backstory that's been invented, where his father is a demon who sleeps with his mother, and Merlin then gets the power, his magical powers, through demonic background, but he manages to retain his soul because he's half human, and he decides that he's going to be good and not evil. But that's where his magic comes from, and that then fits him into this kind of Christian framework that he doesn't otherwise fit into. But we also find that a lot of these figures are referred to as enchantresses or sorceresses, and that has a different set of implications. So if we think about fairies and goddesses, these are figures who are just innately magical, that they don't have to learn how to use their magic. They are magical because they have that power already. Enchantresses and sorceresses, we find a shift then because these are humans who are learning how to perform magic. So we start to see some of these tensions in how these figures are portrayed. And one of the ways that I certainly looked at this before is to then think about what happens next. So we've got this kind of tension around what these characters are, what they do, where they come from, this increasing interest in Christianity in the medieval texts, this Christian framework where the magic of Merlin, for instance, gets reworked so that we can see how it fits in with the rest of the narrative. And then what happens with some of these fairies, I argue, in my book chapter, that I put the details on that, is that we start to see that they get reworked as Christian figures who are able to enact punishment. So the images I've included for you here are from a French and English romance about a character called Melusine, and she's been cursed by her mother. So she's imprisoned her own father, so her mother curses her. And the curse is that every Saturday she turns into a serpent from the waist down. And the twist in that punishment is so she has to stay away from everybody. And if that becomes more widely known that that's what happens on a Saturday, then she'll be transformed into that form for all of the time rather than just on Saturdays. So what we start to see is that these fairies are using their magic as a way of punishing sins. So Melusine's sins are punished from the magic of a mother. And we see this in other romances too. So this is an image from the Lancelot, I think, and it shows Lancelot rescuing a woman from this tub of burning water. And what's really interesting for us is that in the Lancelot, the woman has been placed in that tub of boiling water by God because she's lustful. So she's immersed up to her waist in this boiling water as a punishment. What we find in Malory's Morte d'Arthur, which is right at the end of the medieval period, is that it's Morgan Le Fay that puts that woman in the boiling water. And I think that's on brand for Morgan Le Fay, first of all. But also, we can start to see the way in which this links up in terms of iconography with some of these punishments in hell. So there's this idea across lots of narratives that include hell that you're punished in different places, different parts of your body, depending on the sin. So this division at the waist, being connected particularly with lust and lechery, and that's what we see here. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but these poor characters are being poked by a devil back into a burning bowl of water. And we see this punishment as being kind of really emblematic of hell. And we then see this kind of iconography repeated. Instead of it being God that does the punishing, it's these fairy characters. So I argue in my article, in my book chapter, that I think what we start to see is that this is how these characters get absorbed into a Christian framework, that they become these figures that can punish sin in a way that God does in earlier texts, potentially. What we also have then is a shift in set context in the 15th century. So we kind of explored some of those ideas about goddesses and sorceresses. And then what happens in the 15th century is that ideas about the figure of the witch begin to shift and change. So magic, prior to this kind of shift in tone in the 15th century, is generally seen as being based in texts and learning. So not the kind of magical fairy figures, but humans who want to perform magic. It's often seen as based in text and learning. It's therefore not often very accessible for women, as not as many women are literate. There's also some really interesting, or not interesting, horrible really, stuff going on about women being explicitly excluded from looking at these texts. So there's lots of these books where if you look at the first couple of pages, it says, don't let women touch this book, they will destroy the magic therein. They're explicitly excluded some of the time. But what we find in the 15th century is these ideas about magic start to shift. So first of all, we have more texts in the vernacular, so English or French rather than Latin, which means potentially there's a wider audience. We have higher levels of literacy for women. So we have potential for women to access these magical books themselves. There's also this emerging idea that you can gain magical powers through selling your soul to the devil. Now, this is highly problematic, of course, in lots of ways. After the medieval period, it leads to the witch hunts. It leads to all kinds of horrible things in reality. In the medieval romances, this, of course, also shifts some of the way in which these magical characters might be considered. So, Corinne Saunders talks about this idea of women being seen as potentially more dangerous because of their potentially sinful, tempting gaze and presence, but rather because their bodies could become a means of demonic agency. So this idea then that actually women could get this power immediately, no need to be able to read. You could just sell your soul and then you would have these powers. Certainly that's how it could potentially work in the romances, at least. So within some of these contexts then, we start to see that some of these narratives, some of these romance narratives also begin to shift and change to reflect this. Now, Malory's Morte d'Arthur is a bit before things like the Malleus Maleficarum, which is a little bit later in the 15th century. But we start to see some of these conversations, these ideas, these theoretical approaches emerging at the time that he's writing. And I think we start to see that reflected in his text. I think some of the things we begin to have a think about is the way in which I think Malory looks at simplifying his characters. So we've talked about the complexities of characters like Nimue and Morgan Le Fay. I would argue that Malory simplifies those two characters. So Morgan Le Fay, more categorically evil in Malory. Nimue, more categorically good in Malory. He's very clear that Nimue, she does imprison Merlin, but he is not a nice person in Malory's Morte d'Arthur. He really pursues her. He's only interested in her sexually. And I think she gets a bit, understandably, gets a bit frustrated with that and does lock him away. But what Nimue does in Malory's Morte d'Arthur is she recognises that the impact that will have on King Arthur's court, and she steps in as this magical protector. So she takes Merlin's role as magical protector. Morgan Le Fay becomes more consistently evil, so have a range of schemes and plans to try and bring down Arthur, bring down the court, imprison various knights. It's a particularly wonderful moment where she abducts one of the knights and tries to, well, makes his illness a lot worse, extracts this promise from him that he won't leave her house for a year, tries to seduce him. He's completely, bless him, completely oblivious to this. And then someone explains to him what's going on. And one of my favourite lines from Malory, he says, "I would leave her cut off my hangers than give her any such pleasance," which means he'd rather cut off his testicles than sleep with Morgan Le Fay, which I think in the context is probably quite justified. So we also have this interesting split then. So we've got this kind of good and evil characterization going on of the magical figures. It'd be really easy in this context to think, okay, bad character, let's have her as the witch, let's have her as getting her magic from Merlin, who you remember has the demonic parentage. That'd be a nice, neat resolution, wouldn't it? And that's not what happens. What Malory does instead is that he makes Nimue get her powers through Merlin. So there's a kind of demonic origin there, but she's the good, the better character of the two. Morgan Le Fay goes, when she's young, she gets sent to school in a nunnery, and she comes out of the nunnery a great clerk of necromancy. So there's been quite a lot of critical response to this. It says, this is a commentary on the dangers of giving women an education, which, again, debatable. So we have this kind of split of the two characters, but a complication, perhaps, of some of the origins here. So both here seem to be human figures who are gaining magic through an educational process. Neither of them are selling their soul to the devil, although we've seen precedent for that in the romances. So it's really interesting then that we find the first use in Malory of this word witch is about Morgan Le Fay, who is the evil one. Let's be clear, but she's not a character who's gone through that process that we've seen in other texts or in other traditions around this period around selling her soul. She has in fact learned her magic. She's called elsewhere sorceress and enchantress, and then she gets called a witch. So I think we can start to have a think about some of the implications of this for these characters, I think we can start to think about some of the implications for this in terms of those tags and those names and why those words matter. That kind of swirl of sources, that swirl of names, and what we end up with is one character who's called a witch at the end of it. So I'm very conscious of time, so I wanted to think about then what that means for later on. So we've already talked a bit tonight about the Victorian Revival, this idea that these characters revisited. There's quite a lot of interesting things that have been written about the sexualization of these magical women in the Victorian Revival, which I think maybe misreads some of the medieval sources, because as we've heard tonight, Morgan Le Fay is quite a sexual being already. I think there's also kind of clusters around how these myths are reimagined. There's a particularly interesting set of texts from the 1980s where these characters are often seen as being ways of thinking about emerging ideas or continuing ideas about feminism, about transgression, about how we discuss those and talk about those. This image is from Camelot 3000, where the stories of King Arthur and Knights of the Round Table. Arthur kind of comes back and it's in the space age, and Morgan Le Fay takes over a planet. She has an alien horde. He's still pretty evil though, let's be clear about that. So I think we have these kind of clusters where these characters get reimagined in the particular context in which they appear. And I'd argue that we're seeing a similar phenomenon now in terms of contemporary Arthurian magic. So if you go, I wouldn't normally recommend Wikipedia, but there's a fantastic Wikipedia page, and it looks at, there's one for the Lady of the Lake and there's one for Morgan Le Fay, and it tracks all of the modern day reimaginings of these two characters. And what you'll see is there are hundreds and hundreds of different examples. So it's difficult to kind of make some sweeping assertions about contemporary versions. But a couple that I'd like to pull out as I think being really interesting for us and the way that we're reimagining these figures more recently is Merlin, the BBC TV series. And I think we go back to this idea about labels and where magic comes from. So for those of you who haven't seen it, magic is banned in Camelot in this particular TV series. So it's focused around Merlin, who is secretly has all these magical powers. We also see Morgan Le Fay, who for the first couple of series is this lovely, sweet girl. And then as the series progresses, she becomes the main villain as she realizes that she will never be accepted if she embraces her magical abilities. And here we have magical abilities as being a bit ambiguous. They seem to be both something that you have or you don't have, a little bit like a fairy or a goddess, but also something that you can learn to develop. So there's a kind of educational aspect to it as well. There's also a fantastic series of young adult books called The Legend Born Cycle, and this looks at, it's a present day setting, but it's about a society that are kind of the descendants of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and they kind of inherit magical powers from that. But the main protagonist in that series is a Black student, and she is also exploring the magical abilities that she has from her Black heritage, which is in opposition to the magic that we also find that she has from her Arthurian background. So I think we start to see again this kind of refashioning of what magic is, who has magic, how we can start thinking about some of the conflicts around these magical characters. My third and final example from much more recently is a novel called Morgan Is My Name by Sophie Keach. And this is in the style of a lot of the classical myth reimaginings that we've seen emerge recently. So it retells the story of Morgan Le Fay from Morgan's perspective. It thinks about some of the different stages that she goes through and how she ends up acting the way that she does, and kind of thinking about some of those motivations. Again, I think maybe challenging some of those narratives about where magic comes from, who has magic, and what we mean by some of these terms, fairy, witch, goddess, those kinds of things. I'd also suggest that beyond contemporary Arthurian reworkings, I think we also see the influence of this on narratives and discussions about witchcraft more generally. So I was thinking earlier today about the chilling adventures of Sabrina. I don't know if anyone watched that. And there's a really interesting blend there of thinking about the magical origins of the main character. So she's from a witching family, again, this kind of idea of bloodlines and innate magic. She also goes to magic school where she learns magic. Also, it turns out she's got a kind of demonic background and heritage as well. Part of the series is set in hell. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but I think we've got some really interesting interplays there about some of these discussions, some of these complexities that we see dating right the way back to the medieval period, to the 15th century, where this idea about these labels and these names and these ideas really start to be contested and thought about and discussed. So I'm going to leave it there, but if you're interested in a bit more witchiness, we have an amazing interdisciplinary witches research group you're very welcome to find out a bit more about. I have recorded this, so if you wanted to watch it again, you'd be very welcome to. Okay, thank you.